Subscribe and tap the bell right now, today. Twice a day, we bring you the real code of the samurai, not paraphrased, never softened. Most guidance on fear circulating today treats it primarily as a feeling to manage in the moment, breathe through it, reframe it, talk yourself past it. Bushido approached the same problem as a training discipline instead, built out of specific, repeatable exercises rather than a mindset to adopt in the moment. This isn't really a video about what courage means as an abstract, defined virtue. We've already covered that specific definition elsewhere on this channel in detail. This is the actual practical guide instead, what samurai training genuinely did, concretely, to change a person's whole relationship to fear long before any real threat ever actually arrived. The very first exercise was direct exposure to death itself, deliberately and repeatedly sought out rather than simply avoided. Samurai households sent young men to witness executions, to sit for extended periods near corpses, to study the physical reality of dying at close range, practices that sound extreme to modern ears but were treated with total seriousness at the time. The logic behind it matches a technique still used today for treating phobias. An unfamiliar terror holds disproportionate power over an untested mind, and controlled, repeated exposure under safe conditions drains that power steadily, session by session, until the once overwhelming subject becomes simply something you've already looked at closely and know the actual shape of. The second core exercise was rehearsal without the actual stakes, imagining specific worst-case outcomes in vivid, concrete detail during calm, safe moments, rather than leaving the imagination free to improvise in a real crisis instead. A samurai preparing for a duel he might lose was expected to have already pictured, clearly, exactly how that loss would look and feel, well before stepping onto the actual ground where it might happen. This wasn't pessimism at all. It was preparation for the version of the encounter that any real fight could plausibly produce, so that if it arrived, no part of it was actually unfamiliar anymore. The third core exercise, and the one Hagakure builds its entire teaching directly around, was daily renewal rather than a one-time confrontation with fear. We've covered that text in detail in an earlier video, but the structural point worth repeating here is the discipline of repetition, facing the largest available fear freshly each morning, rather than treating a single past confrontation with it as permanently sufficient. Fear, left completely unexamined for even just a few days, tends to regrow quietly in that gap. The daily version of this practice was designed specifically to prevent that regrowth from ever getting the chance to take hold again. Miyamoto Musashi's own life supplies the clearest evidence that these exercises actually produce something real rather than remaining theoretical. He fought his first duel at 13, an age where an untrained response to real danger should have been paralyzing rather than decisive. It wasn't. Contemporary accounts describe his approach to the fight at Genryojima, arriving deliberately late, armed with a bodkin he'd carved from a spare oar during the crossing, as remarkably composed for a man walking toward a fight he could easily have lost. That composure clearly wasn't an inborn trait. It was the accumulated output of years spent doing exactly the three exercises above, repeated so many times that a genuinely dangerous morning no longer registered as meaningfully different from the hundreds of rehearsed ones that came before it. It's worth being honest about how uncomfortable the first exercise actually was to undergo, because sanitizing it would misrepresent what samurai training actually demanded. Deliberately seeking out the sight of death, repeatedly, on purpose, is not a comfortable practice by any standard, ancient or modern, and there's no version of this guide that pretends otherwise. What made it worth the discomfort, in Bushido's own accounting, was the alternative. A mind that had never done this work carried an unexamined, disproportionate terror of death into every situation that even distantly resembled it, letting that unexamined fear quietly influence decisions that had nothing directly to do with dying at all, a hesitant negotiation, an avoided confrontation, a risk left untaken. The exposure wasn't pursued for its own sake. It was pursued because the alternative, an untested fear left to operate in the background of every decision, was judged to be the worst cause by far. There's also a specific reason the second exercise, rehearsal without stakes, works as well as it does, worth naming directly rather than just asserting. A mind confronting a genuinely new situation for the first time has to do two things simultaneously: process what's actually happening, and manage the emotional flood that novelty itself produces, on top of whatever the situation actually demands. Rehearsal removes the second cause entirely from the real moment by paying it in advance, somewhere safe. By the time Musashi's genuinely dangerous morning at Genryujima actually arrived, the novelty had already been spent, deliberately, on dozens of earlier dangerous mornings that came before it. What remained was simply the practical problem in front of him, handled with whatever attention was left over once the fear itself had stopped demanding a share of it. Applied as an actual guide rather than a philosophy, the method breaks down into 3 concrete moves. First, identify the specific fear you're avoiding and look directly at it, in detail, rather than keeping it vague and unexamined. Vagueness is where fear's power actually lives. Second, rehearse the worst realistic version of it in a calm moment, on purpose, before you're anywhere near having to face the real thing. Third, do this again the next time the fear resurfaces, because a single pass rarely holds. This was never a discipline you completed once and then owned permanently. It was one you kept practicing, the same way Musashi kept training decades after he'd already proven himself beyond any reasonable doubt. It's worth adding a fourth move that samurai training treated as implicit rather than separately named: scale the exercise to match whatever fear you're actually facing, rather than reserving this method exclusively for life or death stakes. The same 3-part structure: look directly at the specific fear, rehearse the realistic worst case in a calm moment, repeat the exercise regularly rather than treating one pass as sufficient, works identically whether the fear in question is a duel or a difficult conversation you've been quietly avoiding for weeks. Bushido's training happened to be built around combat because that was the actual profession, but the underlying mechanism it was training had nothing specifically to do with swords. It was training a mind's basic relationship to the unfamiliar, and that relationship transfers completely to whatever unfamiliar thing you're currently avoiding, regardless of how far removed it is from anything a samurai ever actually faced. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Twice a day, we bring you Bushido straight from the source, the real words of the man who actually wrote the code down, and the real warriors who truly lived it.